Tonight we're in Basildon, and welcome to Question Time. And good evening to you at home, and welcome to our audience here and to our panel, the Liberal Democrat Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, Labour's Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, who's been grilling multinational companies on their tax affairs, Margaret Hodge, the NHS doctor who became a Tory MP, Sarah Wollaston, the contributing editor of the Spectator, Douglas Murray, and the actor and television presenter, Tony, now Sir Tony Robinson. Good, and our first question is from Hugh Malkin, please. Hugh Malkin.
How can MPs justify a pay rise when the rest of us have run out of notches on our belts to tighten?
This is the proposal to put MPs' salaries up from 66 to over £70,000. Tony Robinson.
Yes, I think it's going to be one of those questions where the question got more applause than any of us will get for any of the answers. I think we have to recognise that as far as all the Western democracies are concerned, our MPs are among the lowest. I think there's only 2 below us in terms of pay. Nevertheless, I think my response to that is, so what? I don't think that they deserve to be paid any more, and the reason I don't think they deserve it goes back to the expenses scandal a few years ago. I still don't think that the majority of MPs, even those who weren't directly involved, realise what the offence that scandal caused within the country. It was as though they thought that because they hadn't broken the law, it didn't matter whether what they'd done was morally right or not. And clearly it was morally wrong. We know why they did it. They did it because they felt they hadn't had a pay rise for a long time, so they went round the back way and they got higher expenses to justify the fact that they hadn't got higher wages.
So why does that make it wrong for them to be granted by an outside independent body a wage rise, which is what they get?
May I develop my argument first?
Yes.
Thank you.
But as long as you don't take too long over it, because we've got 4 other people sitting here on the panel eager to get in.
I understand that. The fact is that they were so kind of hoity-toity about the whole thing, weren't they? And yes, I understand what David is saying. It was an independent committee which gave them that money. And I can see why they did it, because our MPs are paid so much less than other MPs. Nevertheless, it's going to take them a long time before they earn the right to come back to us and say that we should have a pay rise, particularly when it's these MPs who every day the decisions that they make are cutting our standard of living and cutting our wages.
Okay. Hold on. Danny Alexander, is this going to be accepted or is it going to be blocked, this proposed increase?
Well, we haven't yet had a recommendation from IPSA, but my answer to the question is no, it's not justified. Look, we are going through very difficult economic times as a country. Millions of people in this country who work in the public sector have had their pay frozen for 3 years. They're going to see pay rises of only 1% this year and for the 2 years after that. Millions more who work in the private sector have seen their wages in many cases reduced or have chosen to work fewer hours to maintain employment in this country. And I think that under those circumstances it would be totally wrong for MPs who are also public sector workers to see a pay rise that is out of keeping with what everyone else in the country is experiencing.
Is it possible to block it, having set up an independent body to recommend a salary?
There is an independent body. It is not accountable to Parliament, so MPs don't have the power to block it, but it's going to be running a consultation. I would urge members of the public, and indeed MPs who have got strong views on this as I do, to make their views known. I mean, the body was set up to be independent precisely for the reasons that Tony gave as to what happened during the expenses scandal, precisely so that MPs should not have any power over their own pay.
What are you saying? Can Parliament say no?
Let me develop my argument, as Tony said.
If you all develop your arguments, we'll never get to the end of the first question.
Well, you may not, but you might hear some interesting arguments.
Well, let's see. The audience will be the judge of that.
They certainly will. The point is that the body was set up to be independent of Parliament, but it shouldn't be independent of reality. And the reality facing millions of people in this country is one of pay restraint, and I hope very much that IPSA will take that into account in what they bring forward. We don't know what they're going to bring forward yet, but I think that is the most important thing, that MPs are not seen to be having an experience in terms of pay that is different to
and
millions
just
of
to
people in this
clarify,
country.
without asking you to go on too long, if IPSA does come in with the recommendation that's been suggested, is there a mechanism by which Parliament can say, it's very kind of you to suggest that, but no, frankly, we don't want it?
And not except changing the law around IPSA, no.
Abolishing IPSA, okay.
But of course MPs could refuse to take the pay rise.
Of course, that would be an individual matter.
That would certainly be my point.
Sarah Wollaston, and then I'll come, the lumbered people their hands up, but Sarah Wollaston.
Well, first of all, what I'd say is that I was still an NHS doctor at the time of the expenses scandal, and it's very demoralising to constantly have this accusation levelled at you. And the point is that the public demanded that MPs' pay was set externally, and I think that's absolutely right. Ironically, if MPs had been deciding on their salary for the next election, we probably wouldn't have voted for a rise. And in fact, it's actually IPSA, the outside body, that's doing that. And why are they doing it? Well, I feel passionately that we need to have more people from all sorts of different backgrounds in Parliament. Parliament needs to look much more like modern Britain. But there are very many people who would find it difficult. For example, head teachers, very many doctors. I wasn't put off by the salary, but I know some that are. Just to put this in context, an NHS GP working the hours that I work would be earning 40,000 more than I do as an MP. And I'm very happy to have done that. I knew what the salary was before I applied, and I'm very privileged to be there. So I'm not personally asking for a rise, but I do think we need to recognise that the public also don't want MPs who've got lots of outside jobs. They don't want a parliament full of people who are independently wealthy. So let's let an independent body set the job, and then let's get on with it. Personally, I'd like to get rid of expenses altogether, set a rate for the job, and let's get on with it.
Okay. And would you like to see that rate set at around the 70,000 figure that's been suggested?
Do you know what? I think it should be set entirely independently of MPs. And I think let's see an end to MPs with conflicting outside interests and lots of other jobs. Let's see a professional parliament.
Let's hear from his members. There's a man there with the spectacles in the third row from the back. You say?
I don't know why the MPs are saying that there's some sort of difficulty in saying no to this pay recommendation. They found it when the Teachers' Pay Review Body came up with a recommendation for teachers' salaries. The MP said, no, we're not going to implement that in full. Why are they having a difficulty in curbing their own pay rise?
Margaret Hodge, can you answer that?
Well, let me start by saying I think we all agree this timing is absurd. It's completely wrong at this time to think that MPs could have a 10% pay increase, if that's what it is. So I agree. Why should we be treated differently from the teachers or all public sector workers or people who are on 0 hours contract, you know, who used to have a full-time job, or people in the private sector who've had to go part-time? I agree with that. But let me just say this. We used to set our own pay, and we got into trouble when we did that. So with the expenses scandal. So what we then did was set up this body completely independent of us, drives lots of us mad lots of the time when we have to deal with them, completely independent with us to set it. That's not working. So I think, in a way, my question goes back to you. What's the best way of settling this issue? How can we have a really grown-up conversation about what we're prepared to pay for politics? And it's partly about MPs' pay, it's partly about the funding of political parties, where the talks broke down today, it's partly about what you expect your MPs to do. Do you want full-time or part-time MPs? And it's about how MPs are selected. So it's that whole bunch of things. I think politics matters, and I think the fact that you've all come out on an evening shows that you think politics matters too. But what we always get stuck on is this debate about how are we going to decide how we pay for our politicians.
Okay, well, let's hear from one or two members of our audience. I'll come to you in a moment, Douglas. The man there in pink shirt.
I think Sarah made the most important point. I think the salary of the MPs isn't as critical as this other issue that we have, which is the secondary jobs that a number of MPs have. And in my view, that is a corrupt system in itself. What should happen is MPs should, in my view, get a rise according to the Independent Party, but they should be banned from having secondary jobs, because that is corrupting the way that the MPs operate. The MPs should be 100% behind their constituents, no other parties.
Okay, and the woman here in the third row.
I'm not really sure why this issue is being raised right now. It seems like it's kind of wasting valuable time on much more important issues that we could be sorting out, and whether MPs should have a pay rise or not is the least of my problems at the moment. So.
That was my...
Yes, I mean, everyone has said, the timing couldn't be worse, and it's obvious that the system is a mess. And the two things that keep coming up, obviously the expenses matter and that of MP pay. Obviously the optics of it are appalling at this point. As has already been said, public sector workers are having their pay frozen, or an increase of 1%, and MPs get a 10% rise. Obviously it looks terrible. However, there is, I think, an argument to be made for, as I think Sarah's already mentioned, an argument for increasing the pay. However, in my opinion, that could only happen, should only happen, if, among other things, something comes back to us, the general public, for that. I think that, for instance, if you increase MPs' pays at this point, either that means that we should sort out, i.e. scrap the expenses system, or it could mean, for instance, that there are fewer MPs. I would love to have seen the boundary review that was proposed, where we could save the money, as it were, of the increase that they would get from having fewer MPs. That's one. And my own view is that people shouldn't be able to get pay rises in their job unless the opposite is possible as well. If you only ever reward people and there's no disincentive, and I was very struck earlier today, I discovered that in Singapore, admittedly not a thriving democracy, but bear with me, in Singapore their politicians have a performance-related pay. Now, I wouldn't mind seeing that. I'm not sure quite how you'd arrange it.
How did they measure it?
Oh, I can't remember. They probably invented it. But
isn't our performance assessed by the electorate when we go to an election?
Barely.
Yeah. Well, wait a minute.
I think you'd find all sorts of unnecessary letters being written and questions being tabled in order to meet the performance targets.
No, but
doing the job by
on Margaret Hodge's theory that
for their constituents.
On Margaret Hodge's theory that the electorate decide. If you go into opposition, you get paid less, and when you're back in office, you get paid more. Because the electorate have voted for you, right?
But isn't it extraordinary that you can have some MPs that only turn up twice to make 2 speeches in Parliament this year, for example, Gordon Brown, and he gets the same pay as an MP that speaks very regularly. That's what's wrong. There's no performance management for MPs.
So more Gordon Brown, Margaret.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to the argument that MPs should spend full time on the job.
Okay.
There's a lot to do, and we shouldn't think we can do it.
Let's hear from our audience. The woman there. Yes.
I think Sarah makes a very good point about attracting people into politics. One of the problems, aside from the other interests that many MPs have, is that they're actually already independently wealthy and it doesn't really matter to them. So I think Sarah makes a very good point, although I agree with the lady over there that it's perhaps not... talking about whether they get a pay rise right now is not top of my priorities.
But if many of them are independently wealthy, would you rather see a bigger salary so that you attract people who didn't have private means?
Yes.
Yes. And the woman behind you, yes, there.
Just going to add a word of caution in terms of performance-related pay. I work in the NHS and we all know how successful performance and targets are within the NHS, so I think we should be cautious before we introduce it anywhere else.
And you said in the centre here.
In the past, politicians did have second jobs and still did a super job. You take Churchill, right up until the Second World War, he had to make his money by writing articles for newspapers and do that. And I think this idea that politicians getting £70,000 or £80,000 a year when they don't even work a whole year, they don't work 52 weeks of the year, is got to be at the key of the debate. And I think Margaret was right as well when she said it's to do with selection. If you want ordinary people to come into politics, then you've got to select ordinary people. It's no good just, looking at Falkirk at the moment, and maybe we'll come to that later. They've already pre-selected the person who's going to win, or so they think. But that doesn't mean that that's necessarily representative of the people who are going to vote.
Okay, well, let's go to Falkirk, since you raised it. Emily Rivers got a question on it. Emily?
How much control over the Labour Party do the unions really have?
This is Falkirk, of course, where Len McCluskey is alleged to have manipulating his own person in as the Labour Party candidate. Tony Robinson.
First thing I think we need to do is recognise the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, working people didn't have any representation at all, and the trade unions decided that if they were going to be able to do something about that, they needed to form their own parliamentary party in order to ensure that there was legislation for working people. And that worked very well. So trade union culture has always been central to the Labour Party, and indeed trade union money has. And although I know some people raise an eye at that, the fact that shed loads of money goes to the Conservative Party from private capital means that unless actually you did have that kind of funding from the trade unions, we wouldn't be able to run a two-party democracy. So I'm just saying that because I think it's important to understand why it's important to have trade unions involved in the Labour Party. As far as this particular issue is concerned, every party now and then has a problem about somebody trying to muscle in to get the nomination because people are attracted by power. Absurdly, they think that MPs have power, and so they want to become MPs. And this particular one appears to happen to have involved trade unionists. What is really important, and what I think will answer your question, is how well or badly that's been dealt with. And it seems to me that by and large it's been dealt with pretty well. The party itself has been frozen, the nomination has been frozen. Tom Watson, the minister in charge, resigned today, and I think it was absolutely appropriate that he did, because one of the people in his office was the successful candidate in the original Falkirk elections. So I think it's been conducted pretty well, which would seem to imply that inappropriate trade union intervention into the Labour Party is by and large a thing of the past. Okay. And I think you can see that by the macho, bullish outrage of Ken McCluskey, who clearly feels absolutely thwarted.
Okay. Douglas Alexander, do you think that the thing has been, Daniel Alexander has been properly handled?
I think Douglas Alexander would have given you a slightly
Douglas
different
Alexander would have given you
to the one I'm about to give.
It was Freudian. I wished for a moment that he was here.
Oh, that's very nice of you.
But welcome back.
Thank you very much indeed. I think this is a pretty extraordinary situation, actually, because you have a state of affairs where Ed Miliband was elected leader of the Labour Party, not by the members of his party who voted for his brother, but by the unions whose block vote overturned the views of the members of the party. You now have a situation where it appears, and of course none of us have seen this famous report that is kept so secret, that the union has been trying to manipulate the selection to get its own person selected as a Labour MP. I think if I was an ordinary member of the Labour Party in Falkirk who joined the party with a view to trying to shape who was selected, what my party did and so on, I'd be pretty frustrated that this union was trying to thwart my choice and force its own person on me. And I say one other thing, as Chief Secretary I've spent a lot of time negotiating with the TUC and with the trade unions on things like public sector pay, which we were talking about earlier, on public service pension reform and so on. And I actually think trade unions play a very important role in our industrial relations, speaking up for their members in the workplace, doing so very effectively, making representations to government ministers and others. And I think they do themselves a real disservice by getting mixed up in the politics of one political party like this. It would be much better for the trade unions themselves and their ability to speak up for their members without fear or favour, whichever party was in government, if they were much less entangled in the Labour Party and focused much more on their day job, which is speaking up for their members.
Okay, Margaret Hodge, do you agree with that?
Well, the question was, do the trade unions control the Labour Party? That was actually the question that Emily asked, and I think the answer to Emily is no, they don't. But let's look at the argument. The genesis, the traditions, the roots of the Labour Party are that we came about because we are there to protect and promote the interests of working people and policies in that direction. And those are very similar roots to the ones from the trade union. In fact, we sprung out of the trade union movement. So, of course, there's a close partnership link in the ideology and the values that underpin the trade union movement today, which I think does play an important role, and that underpins the Labour Party. But it is completely and utterly and totally unacceptable that any sectional interest, any trade union, ought to interfere in the selection of a candidate for a particular seat. That is just plain wrong. And what Ed Miliband did was immediately stop that, immediately suspend the selection. He's called it in. He's suspended a number of people in the party, including the person who was hoping to be the candidate. And we'll now have an open, transparent system.
But there is an agenda here, isn't there? I mean, you describe it as just being slightly sort of improper, but there is an agenda on the part of...
I think it's really wrong.
But there's an agenda on the part of Unite and Tom Watson. I mean, Tom Watson talks about Tony Blair having marched Labour into the arid desert of pragmatism. This is a deliberate attempt to move the party to the left. That's how it seems.
Well, let me just say this. If it were that, we wouldn't have Unite week after week after week getting up on the airwaves and complaining about the policies that the Labour Party is putting forward. Let's just think. They've complained about our policy on public sector pay. There'll probably be some people in the audience that agree with them. They've complained about our attitude to the spending cuts. They've complained about the benefit cap. These are three
That's exactly what I'm saying, that they're trying to move the party to the left.
No, but if they were an influence, if they controlled the Labour Party, you wouldn't see this independence.
Right,
now, it's a partnership.
Hold on, Margaret.
It's a partnership. It's not control.
Just last year, notes were found from one of your shadow ministers' meetings, Ministry of Justice, saying we should raise this issue, but we just need to double check with the trade union concerned before we do, because we need to make sure it doesn't upset them. I think there is a much deeper and more problematic thing going on here than you described.
Well, I've really got to come back on this, because this is just not true. If you work in partnership with organisations, you work, Danny, in partnership with organisations, Sarah does do, and you will always consult your stakeholders on anything you do. And the trade unions are an important partner. They do provide the funding. But to say that they control either the policy, they control the selections, they control the direction is plain wrong.
All right.
And what it really offends me, let me just say this final thing, David, what really offends me, I've got a lot of people in my Labour Party who are individual trade unionists. They would be as offended by what Unite did here in Falkirk as actually everybody here is in the audience and we are here on the panel.
Okay, you say.
With the amount, this Margaret Hodge, trade union bosses and Labour MPs, when was the last time you had a working class wage? Because you earn so much money and union bosses earn so much money. When was the last time, you say you represent the working class, when was the last time you had a working class wage of, say, 20,000? You know, you're talking crap.
Well, I think the point has been well made that we need a much more representative body. In fact, what I really think is that the way that Sarah Wollaston was selected is a really good model, and we have in her somebody who has got a lot of experience because she was a doctor, who's pretty independent. I think she probably offends her whips every now and then, and who really contributes to Parliament. So let's open up the selections. And I'm the first one to be with you that I think one of the problems with politics is there are too many people now who come into it, who've never done anything else before, and who live in the Westminster bubble, live in the Westminster village, and don't really understand what's going on.
Sarah Wollaston, then I come to you, Douglas.
I think there's a wider problem here. Falkirk as a constituency hasn't changed hands since 1935. And that's why this is so important, because the selection effectively will decide who is going to be the MP for Falkirk, maybe for decades. And that's why this is so offensive. And there are safe seats like this all around the country, both for Conservative and for Labour. And it's equally important, this issue, for both of them. That why is it that just a handful of people get to decide that MP? And the thing about open primaries, and I was the beneficiary of an open primary, is that everybody, whatever their party political affiliation, gets to have a stake in what type of MP you have within a safe seat. So, for example, in my case, they were able to choose a centre-right Conservative MP. In Falkirk, perhaps the people in Falkirk would like the opportunity to have a centre-left MP, but they won't get the opportunity to do that if the votes are rigged by Unite, and that's why it's so offensive. So I'm really delighted to hear what Margaret said, and I think it would be fantastic if the Labour Party would also pilot an open primary, and they don't have to be expensive. The criticism in my case was that it was too expensive. There are lots of ways you could pilot making open primaries much cheaper. So I'd really like to see the Labour Party take that forward, and maybe Unite could even fund it. That would be great, wouldn't it?
You say.
I agree with David. I think the Labour, under New Labour, the unions are finding it very, very difficult to reconcile and support them. They would like to go more to the left, and they're finding it extremely difficult to do that now under New Labour, because there's very, very little difference, in my opinion, between policies with the Tories, Liberal Democrats and New Labour. And I think McCluskey wants to get involved with that and pull them to the left.
Okay. And you, sir, over there on the gangway?
Thank you. This goes back to that Blackadder episode where Baldrick becomes the MP for the Rotten Borough, and where he is and where his colleague is the only voter and he voted 16,000 times.
I think I'd support the two last speakers on the panel. I think the best way to clean what appears to be the Aegean stable here would be to have an open election. I know a lot of people in Falkirk think the same thing. And I welcome that last point that you made, that there's no point any political party being high-minded about this and saying, oh, this is just happening in the Labour Party. This kind of thing happens in all parties, okay. And what's important is that it's always stamped on quickly.
Douglas Murray.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is the great problem, isn't it, is that every party has this problem. It's the unions in the case of the Labour Party, it's major businessman fundraisers in the case of the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, and it is to an extent in the Labour Party as well. It's a sort of circular firing squad which we keep on seeing in our politics. The question of how our politics is to be funded isn't an easy one, because very few people in this country, I think myself included, would actually want state funding of political parties, as some other countries have. But, you know, there are two problems I'd cite about this quickly. One is the fact that this plays once again, this story, into the perception, which I think is correct, that across the parties, effectively politics is a type of closed club. And if you join at an early age and you dedicate yourself to the machine and you're part of the machine, you butter up the right people and so on, then politics is for you. And that is a perception which I think rightly occurs across all political parties. So few people now are actually engaged in political parties. And that, I would say, is one of the reasons for it. But another point, and I'll just finish with this. It is very striking to me that tonight, and this isn't a criticism of David or the producers, but it is very striking to me, we have now had two questions, and they are both about procedural issues of politics. This is about how the thing is done, how Parliament works and so on, but this is a world away from what most of us care about. Most of us who are interested or slightly interested in politics, we care about all sorts of things, how our children are going to be educated, how the NHS is or isn't going to work, a whole set of things, where Britain is in the world, how we fund things. And instead, in this country, as I say, we have got into this situation where, you know, we end up talking about how much George Osborne spent on a hamburger. It is such a pitiful situation for a state like Britain to be in.
All right. I just remind you, the questions on Question Time are not chosen to our agenda, but to the audience's agenda.
Absolutely.
And the reason we chose that as our first question was that we had more questions on that than on any other topic.
I think it's
so just put that in your pipe and smoke it. I think that's enough. That's enough.
It's sad.
That's enough. And you can join in tonight's debate if you want to at home by text or Twitter. Our hashtag is BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time. You can text comments to us, 83981. Press the red button to see what others are saying. And now a question, please, from Nicky Johnson. Nicky Johnson.
Will a £200 a year NHS levy on non-EU migrants crack down on health tourism?
And in view of my rebuke to you, Douglas Murray, I'll let you start on that.
That's very kind. Look, it's not going to sort out the issue, obviously, but I do think it addresses a legitimate concern of the public. Somebody put it very well the other day, saying it is a national health service, not an international health service. There is a major problem when people are able to take out of a system that they have not put into. And I think that it is the least that can be expected of people, that if they have not paid into the NHS at any point, and then they find themselves in Britain and they need to use the NHS, that people who have paid for it all their lives do not pay for those people. And I must say, I'm rather sad as well to notice that in the last few days since this has been mooted, the extent to which people have sort of basically avoided that fundamental and rather obvious issue, and have instead, I think, tried to deflect a part of the debate by pretending, for instance, that this is somehow bigoted or xenophobic or anything like this. It isn't. I simply think it would be common sense even if we were not in recession.
OK. Labour's shadow Public Health Minister Diane Abbott said, "What price xenophobia, stigmatising foreigners accessing NHS, creates a public health risk." Margaret Hodge, do you agree with her?
Well, I think this was one of the most depressing stories of the week. When I look back at, when I was preparing today, I felt really depressed. And I'll tell you why. My committee looks at the finances of the NHS, and they are in dire straits. We've probably got between a third and a half of NHS trusts which are basically bust. They're in deficit. They're bankrupt. At the same time, we've got all the pressure on A&E. You know about it here. I know about it down the road in Romford. And we've got things like the 111 doesn't work. These are the big issues of the NHS. That's what I want my Secretary of State for Health to address. I want an NHS free at the point of use for all of us here in Britain. And to divert us, it's not that I disagree particularly with the policy, but to divert us onto this issue rather than tackling that, to always slag off the NHS. That's what he does all the time. He derides it, he's critical of it. I think is just a terrible, terrible way forward. So I want my Secretary of State to tell me, how are the hospitals, how are the GPs going to cope with the declining finances? How is the quality going to improve? How are we going to get this new 111 service working? And when he's done that, then he can do, this is a tiny amount of money within the totality of everything that is spent. 109, 110 billion, Danny? Something like that. This is, 12 million in 109 billion. Get the big picture, focus on the big picture, and give us the NHS we deserve.
To clarify, you are against the £200.
Well, let me just say something on
just that.
OK, let me just say something on that, because as a lot of people know here, I'm an MP from down the road in Barking and Dagenham, where we've had a total transformation of our community through migration. And I've, for years and years, been actually really saying things that have been considered very radical. So I think if people come in, new migrants come in, they have to spend a bit of time. They have to earn their time here, spend the time here before they can access services. Now, the sort of services I'm talking about are actually the services which are rationed by us. So, for example, social housing, council housing. There isn't a council or social house for everybody, and you ought to have time spent in your community before you get it.
And the NHS?
Benefits, let me check.
Well, no, come to the NHS, because we've got to stick to the questions, or we'll never get through the programme.
But the benefits is the same. I don't know why Polish workers here are sending child benefit to their families in Poland. That seems to be a nonsense. But on the NHS and on education, just think about it, all of you. If you have got a newly arrived migrant here with children, it does put pressure on school places, but should we not give that child a place? And the same, and when it goes to the NHS, actually there are pretty good rules. We get most of the money in. There's 12 million that we don't get in. OK, let's tighten it up a bit, but this is not the big picture. It's not the big picture. And don't let yourself get, don't let him get you on this and think, if we get a little bit more out of migrants, we'll solve the real difficult issues facing us to give us the NHS we want.
Danny Alexander.
Well, I think this proposal is a sensible one. It's actually just doing what many other countries around the world already do. As you will know, if you've applied for a visa to go to Australia or New Zealand, or you look at what they do in Finland or in other European countries. And what we're saying here is that when someone applies for a visa to come to the UK, that they should make a small financial contribution to defray the costs of using our National Health Service when they're here. What it won't mean is that if someone is in that circumstance and turns up at A&E and needs emergency treatment, that they'll be denied it. Of course not. But what it is about is ensuring that people who come here to use the NHS make a financial contribution towards doing so. Margaret's of course right to say that the amounts of money involved are small compared to the £110 billion budget of the National Health Service, and we're making major changes. Just last week we announced, I think, one of the most radical reforms within the health system, linking up health and social care with a shared pot of money to be jointly commissioned by health bodies and local councils to end the scandal where you have elderly, vulnerable people who fall down the cracks between our health service and our social care service. By joining those two things up, I think we can get better services for our elderly people with less money to go around. It's a genuinely big and radical change we spent a lot of time talking about last week, but it is also an important principle, I think, that people who come here to our country should make a financial contribution for using the health service.
We'll hear from one or two majorities. The woman there in the third row. Yes.
Absolutely agree with your point that, you know, you get out what you put in, but I think we're all missing a really, really crucial point here, and it's the fact that the decision makers in the NHS are at fault as well. I've got a close family member who's in the coalface at the NHS, and she's seeing it disintegrate in front of her eyes. Money is being put in the completely wrong places, and people are definitely seeing a shift towards much more privatisation in the NHS. It might not be happening completely now, but that's definitely where it's going. And I, for one, don't want to see that happen. And I know for a fact that my close family member who's in the coalface of the NHS doesn't want to see that happen either.
And do you think that this £200 fee is a step towards asking other people to pay for the services of the NHS then?
It is perhaps, but I also think that we need to take an inward look at where this £10 million budget for NHS spending is being spent already, and have a rejig of that and really examine where money is being spent.
And the person in the very back there on the right.
I was a GP before I retired some years ago, and I remember the first time a patient came to see me from overseas and I didn't know the procedures. This is an American guy who was insured up to the ears with a reasonably minor problem. And I phoned up the organisation that we were answerable to then, called the Family Practitioner Committee, and I said, what do I do about this guy? Do I charge him? And he said, well, doctor, you've got two options. You can see him as a private patient yourself, or if you can't be bothered to do that, sign him on as a temporary resident, which means we'll pay you to see him. He was willing to pay. Everything was up front, he was insured, but the NHS then could not be bothered to take the money.
Okay. And what's your view about the £200 flat fee?
If you're going to do it, it's not enough.
Right.
How's £200 going to cost?
Okay. Sarah Wollaston, as yourself a GP before you became an MP, what do you think of this proposal?
Well, the point is we don't know how much health tourism costs us, because the point is that there's a positive incentive for hospitals not to find out if somebody is chargeable, and the extent of it is probably greater than 12 million, but we can't be sure.
What's the incentive?
Explain. The incentive is that if you actually declare that somebody isn't entitled to NHS treatment, you then as a hospital have to chase them for the money, and if they default on that debt and disappear, you don't get paid at all. So it's actually much better for hospitals to keep quiet, not to detect people, because then they'll be paid anyway. So I think that's the point, is we don't know the extent of it. And like the gentleman who's just spoken, I've come across people who've been desperate to pay for treatment in hospitals, have been trying to pay, and the hospitals won't accept it because it's too bureaucratic for them to handle it. Now that's totally unacceptable, and that's partly why we need a review to say what systems can we put in place to collect this money that is due to the NHS. We don't want to see doctors having to collect money at the surgery, and I don't think that's going to happen. What we want from our NHS doctors is to be compassionate and focused on the patient that's in front of them. But there is no doubt that there are problems within the system and great uncertainty. And just to give you an example of how this works, I have a constituent who was injured in a terrible industrial accident, had paid into our tax system for very many years, went abroad, and as an expatriate came home and was honest and said he's living abroad, and because of that he wasn't entitled to any treatment. Now a student coming from exactly the same country would have been entitled to have free treatment the minute they stepped off the plane. Now that's clearly not a fair system. So I think this is about fairness. It's about fairness to all of you in the audience, because NHS resources are tight. But yes, we want a compassionate NHS, an NHS that will always respond to people with no questions asked if in an emergency situation, and absolutely right that we have a review to make sure there aren't any unforeseen consequences on public health and people perhaps who are homeless. We don't want to see any widening of health inequalities because of this measure. But yes, this is fundamentally about fairness and the fact that the NHS resources are limited.
Okay. I'd like to hear from one or two more members. Can I come to you, Tony? The man up there at the very back in the pink shirt, that's you. Yes.
Is it not true that the reason the current government and the government before are leaving the NHS to go to ruin is because they've got outside business interests which will profit from the privatisation of the NHS?
Okay. And you, sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to a couple of the panel. I'm a doctor as well. I think we've got a room full of doctors tonight. And I agree that with a couple of you that it is a principle thing, and we probably should be charging to make it fairer. But I also tend to agree with Margaret Hodge that the danger is that it's not only about principles, but about a limited attention that we have, and this is a very small issue in much, everything's falling apart around us, and we're focusing on minutiae.
Okay. And you said
the £200 is just minimal, and I doubt whether it would be possible to cover the cost of supervising and enforcing that rule and leave any money for the Treasury.
Okay. Are you a doctor too?
No.
I'm really glad that the debate has swung in the way that it has, because when it started, it was like there was this one-line proposal which somehow keyed into our anxieties that it should be people who contribute to the NHS who get the proper service from the NHS, which I think is something that most people would agree with. But it was, I felt for a moment as though we weren't actually going to scrutinise what the proposal itself actually meant. And I think the point that the gentleman up there made earlier is a terribly good one, which is that it's going to be so difficult to get that money back that you're going to have to set up this really cumbersome administrative system. No. And as it's only going to save, what, 12 million quid or whatever, it is going to be a bit more of a gesture than something which is going to transform the NHS in any profound way. The other thing that concerns me is a public health issue. I don't want us ever to be in a situation where people come to our country, have a little cough, the cough gets a bit bigger, you and I would go to the doctor, they don't, and it turns out to be some terrible disease. They have spots, they just scratch the spots, rub a cream on, don't go to the doctor, and then we have a huge breakout of something awful. And that's what I fear from this kind of attitude.
Well, hold on, Tony, the proposal precisely is not that this should be something that's sort of paid over the counter when someone turns up at a hospital. It's precisely to avoid those sorts of problems. That's what's being suggested, is that when someone applies for a visa, when they're in their home country, in addition to paying a fee for their visa, they pay £200 or whatever the actual number turns out to be to use the National Health Service. And look, this is not about distracting from the issues in our NHS. This is the 65th anniversary of our brilliant National Health Service, and there are big issues. There are issues about the care for our elderly, which I mentioned earlier. There are issues about the culture of secrecy and closedness that built up over many years, particularly when the Labour Party was in government, which has made it harder than it should be for people to blow the whistle when there are problems in our National Health Service. So of course we should have an open debate about those things. But that does not mean it is wrong to ask people from overseas who are coming to our country to make a small financial contribution for using our National Health Service.
The woman in the fourth row there, 1, 2, 3, 4, yes.
It's the principle of the thing, actually, that we're trying to give this impression that you can't come here and get everything for free. So it doesn't matter how many people or how much it's going to cost. It's actually giving that impression to people that, you know what, we're going to put a block on it now. You can't scaremonger people by turning around and saying, oh, that will get diseases. 1 minute you're saying there's not many people, and then your next minute you're saying they're going to get a disease. And as Danny said, they're not going to stop you going to A&E.
I'm quite happy to assert principles, but I want to see principles that really work. My point is, A, that I don't want us to start shifting into a culture where public health is at risk. And secondly, I want to make sure that the things that we do actually make the National Health Service better.
But
my
we
fear
need to
is,
start
my
somewhere.
fear is, yes, but the question really is whether this is the appropriate place to start.
But Labour are always afraid to start somewhere.
I think there are far more serious issues which some of the other people in the audience have picked up that we should be addressing first, and when we get those sorted out, then we'll have a better NHS.
You said something about what Margaret Hodge said? You with her or not?
At least this, I mean, I don't support this particular government now. They're doing lots and lots of welfare cuts that are really affecting a lot of people. But on this particular issue, they're not scared to say, actually, I think we should start charging people that come from abroad.
Okay.
Labour never did that.
Okay. I'll take a couple more points. Then we've gone. The woman up there in the second row from the back. Yes. Yes.
Considering we don't know how many illegal immigrants are over here, how are you going to charge them?
Danny Alexander?
Well, that is, look, one of the issues here is that our immigration system has been allowed to go to rack and ruin over very many years, and when Labour were in office, they stopped the business of counting the number of people who left the country. We no longer have exit checks, so we can't. We have some idea of who's coming in. We have no idea who's coming out. We're reintroducing those as a coalition government. We are making, for certain groups of people, it harder to come into this country, as it should be.
And you stopped ID cards, Danny. You stopped ID cards.
Yes, we did stop ID cards, Margaret. I think ID cards was a huge invasion.
But it might have been a way of identifying people.
Of the civil liberties of every single person in this country. It was illiberal, it was wrong, and we were right to stop it.
So what's your answer to the lady's point, which is what you're going to do about people who are illegally here now? You're going to find ways of charging them because you won't be able to identify them.
Well, this policy is about people. This policy is about people who are coming into this country, applying for a visa, paying a charge up front. It won't address that particular point. It is one that we are looking at, and particularly looking at, can we put more resources into removing people who are here illegally, because that in the end is what should happen.
Okay, I'll take a couple more points, then we'll get to another question. You say yes.
Yes, Danny mentioned about visas and Tony mentioned about spots. Would it not be sensible to have a health screen before they leave their home country?
Okay, and the woman up there at the very back in the middle. Yes.
I'd like to say that after what seems to be a very depressing conversation, that if the NHS is disintegrating at the rate that everybody seems to think it is, as a frequent user of it recently and having many family members who've used it, I'd like to say they're doing an exceptional job of covering it.
Okay. We'll move on to another question from Jan Kamal, please.
Can a military coup and the overthrow of a democratically elected president ever be justified? Ever
be justified? Of course, thinking of Egypt and the removal of President Morsi. Douglas Murray.
I think there are situations where it can be. Whether or not it's the most desirable thing, I'd certainly question. I think I was on this programme a couple of years ago when President Mubarak had just been overthrown. And I remember saying then that the likely scenario was that the Muslim Brotherhood would come to power and that would be a catastrophe for Egypt. I think that has come to pass. And I think that the country is facing a much less easy to foresee future now. My own view on it is that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an ideology of which is, I mean, the easiest way I always think of it, it is basically a fascist political party, albeit a Muslim fascist political party. It is a terrible and corrosive influence across the region, and it cannot answer the basic needs and desires of the peoples of the countries it now is trying to govern. And I think we've seen that, and the Egyptian people have seen that, and they have felt that for the last year. I mean, minorities in Egypt, I haven't been to the country since the revolution, but one of my colleagues at the Henry Jackson Society just got back, and the treatment of minorities, religious minorities, women, is absolutely terrible in Egypt, and the Egyptian people are suffering this. Now, the army have stepped in for those and many other reasons, most obvious of which is the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood cannot answer the Egyptian people's economic needs.
But the question was whether it can be justified. Well, and in your view, from the gist of what you're saying is you think in this circumstance...
Well, I actually think, my own view is that the army actually has gone in too early. I think that the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology, like fascism in Europe, has to be seen to be completely defunct, has to be seen to be incapable of ruling, and a vicious thing that must be got out of the system, of the political system. I think that the army has probably stepped in too early for that. I think that another few months even of Morsi would have clarified that. As it is, I fear very much that the Brotherhood is going to continue, and the embers are still obviously very hot, and they are going to hold on to the idea that although they didn't get it right necessarily this last year, that there is a possibility in the near future that the Brotherhood could govern and govern well. Okay. I think that that ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood has to be, as I say, eviscerated as completely as fascism was in Europe after 1945.
Danny Alexander, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because President Obama, our own Foreign Secretary, is saying they don't actually in principle approve of democratic governments being overthrown. And yet, well, do you approve of this overthrow of this government?
No, look, I don't support military intervention to overthrow a democratically elected government. It's not the right way to resolve disputes in a democracy. Equally, we have to work as a country with whoever is the government of the day. We have British nationals who are living there. We have British businesses who are doing business in Egypt, and so we have to maintain relations with the Egyptian state and appeal to them to try and resolve this in a way that is as democratic as possible, as quickly as possible. But you also need to have in a democracy political parties and people from different perspectives working together to make their constitution work. And it's clear from the protests on the streets of Egypt that there are an awful lot of Egyptians who just feel that that wasn't happening. And so it is a very difficult situation, but I certainly don't think that military intervention of the sort that we've seen is the right way to resolve these sorts of disputes. They should be resolved within a democratic and constitutional framework. And it does set a dangerous precedent that when everything starts to go wrong, the army can just go back in to try and solve them. You know, we want to see the Arab Spring, we've seen it in many countries now, you know, lead countries, and it's obviously a very difficult process for many of the countries affected, towards having proper democracies where governments change through elections. That must be the outcome that we're looking for, and it's a shame that this has happened to Egypt at this stage.
The Americans, of course, fund the Egyptian army to, I think, over $1 billion a year. Do you think the American administration had foreknowledge of this and gave it a nudge and a wink approval?
I've no idea whether the American administration had foreknowledge of this. I have to say, quite a lot of the Western media appeared to have foreknowledge of it, because it was reported for days and even weeks in advance as these protests developed that the military in Egypt was considering an intervention, and clearly, as they'd been the government in the country before, that was always a risk. I think it is preferable, though, highly preferable, that in those sorts of circumstances, democratic politicians should work to resolve their differences, and governments should be changed where the where the democratic will of the people is to that effect.
Tony Robinson?
I think it shows more than anything else how hard democracy is. Particularly if you come from a country which has had a dictator for 30 or 40 years, and probably the only reason that dictator got in the first place was because everybody, different religions, different factions, were kicking lumps out of each other, so a strong man was invited in. When the strong man is overthrown, what happens? Do people suddenly go, oh, we love democracy? No, they don't. They start kicking lumps out of each other again, and that's what we're seeing here. So in a way, is it right for the army to intervene? Doesn't seem to me to be quite the right question. It's a struggle for the Egyptian people to find their democracy, and I don't think that we can just sit on the sidelines and tut-tut. We've been through all this. We've had our civil war. We've had our Tonapandi and our Peterloo. We've had blood on the streets, and we have this luxury that it wasn't our blood that was sacrificed. It was our forefathers and our foremothers. And when I see something like this, I think to myself, we tend to be terribly cavalier about our own democracy. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen revelations about terrible incursions into our privacy by security, both government security and private security. And I think we've just been a bit lazy about this. And when we see something like that happening in Egypt, I think that it's beholden on us to be absolutely rigorous to protect our own democracy, because it's so valuable.
Okay. Jan Kamal, if you want to come back on this, do. But in the meantime, I'll come to you in the second row there, and then you over there, sir. Yes.
Okay, well, on the subject of whether they intervened too early, let's bear in mind that the Muslim Brotherhood was volunteering its members to start suicide bombing in the name of the cause. And, well, it's not the best way to do this, but I'm not hearing any better way to have done it. Wouldn't it have been nice if they'd sat at a table and talked? Well, it wasn't going to happen. Okay. So let's hope that we get a decent secular guy going and do our best to induce a democracy that's respectable.
And you sat there on the right.
Yeah, it was the tourism trade. I was over there in January on holiday, and he said there used to be 6 coaches going to the pyramids, and there's only 1 now going to the pyramids because the tourism trade's gone right down the pan.
I couldn't agree, but can I give one reason for that? President Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood leader until yesterday, very recently appointed, among others, as regional governors. As governor of Luxor, one of the people engaged in the terrorist assault on tourists in 1997 in Luxor. This was when dozens of Swiss and other tourists were beheaded at the Luxor archaeological sites.
Right.
And for Morsi to make a man involved in that the governor, that is the ultimate insult not only to Egypt, but to anyone who would want to visit the country.
Margaret Hodge. What did you say?
Exactly the same thing in Northern Ireland when we've elected terrorists to be ministers in instalment. That's embarrassing to soldiers like me and soldiers who have died out of the streets of Northern Ireland, and we see the murderers actually getting paid by the taxpayers.
I can assure you I'm not wild about that either.
Margaret Hodge.
I was born in Egypt, although I left at the age of 4, and so I don't really have an inside knowledge of the politics of Egypt or a memory of it. But I think almost we've been asking too much. Just think back, it's 2 years since that Arab Spring was sprung upon us. And I think moving from, it wasn't 30 years, it's 50, 60 years of military-led autocracy into a mature democracy overnight is just too big an ask. So I think we should try and hang on to the sort of whole feel of the Arab Spring and feel some strength by that. I just want to come back on Douglas on one thing, because I hate to think that this is about religion. I don't think it is about religion. I think where Morsi failed is he was incompetent. He was incompetent on the economy, and he was incompetent on his politics, and you gave an example of that. But remember also that the Muslim Brotherhood had 80 years, am I right? 80 years when they were tortured, they were imprisoned by the previous despots who ruled Egypt. And I think there's a danger in turning this into a pro and anti-religious thing. I think it's bad politics, bad...
All right.
And
I'm sorry, Sarah Wollaston, because we've reached the final point of the programme. Sarah Wollaston.
I think this coup is very worrying. Across the world, we're trying to persuade extremists to abandon extremism and turn to the ballot box. And I think that actually the message this sends to them is why bother. So I think that's why it's so worrying. And I think this won't end well. And I think we should all be concerned about that. But the point is, this is for the Egyptian people. This isn't for us. And we should not be intervening.
Okay. Sorry to those who have your hands up, and sorry to the panellists who want to come back in, but time's up. If you've been listening to this on BBC Radio 5 Live, you can continue the debate, Question Time, Extra Time, with Steve Nolan and John Pienaar. This is the last Question Time of the run. We're going to be back early in the autumn, Thursday the 12th of September to be precise, in London, and on the 19th of September in Rochdale. And if you want to come, or know anyone who'd like to come to take part in the programme, the number to call is 0330 123 9988, or they can apply, or you can apply on our website. I hope you've all enjoyed this run. Thanks for your tweets and your texts that have enlivened the programme. My thanks to our panel here, to our audience in Basildon, and from everyone who's involved in the production of Question Time. Until September, good night.
Journalist Victoria Derbyshire and Ash Atala join Andrew Neil next on BBC One. This Week is on the way.